Hello, everybody. Welcome along to the Event Industry News podcast with me, James Dickson. Wishing you all a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever or wherever you tune into today's podcast from. Let's get straight in to today's podcast because my guest is on a tight time frame. According to the Global Recovery Insights 2021 report, 62% of exhibitor respondents expressed plans to attend shows with the same or increased frequency as pre-pandemic. Since the beginning of this year, 2022, global events have, for the most part, returned to in-person programming with higher attendance than ever before and more brands ready to make the move to go global. My guest today is a dynamic, award-winning business leader with over 15 years experience across marketing, sales, and government. He is currently the Vice President of Client Service at Impact XM, a global full-service event and experiential marketing agency. I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast for the very first time, Mr. James C. Morris. James, thank you very much for joining the Event Industry News podcast.
Thank you, James. Appreciate you having me.
Not a problem at all, and a lovely on-brand sort of. I must ask: is that a real office or is this a background that we've got?
No, it's virtual. As much as we've been so sad
great
with the virtual response, we nice little virtual background.
Well,
Thanks, I appreciate it.
It looks good. I wouldn't have known. That's why I asked. Whereabouts are you joining us from today, James?
So I'm currently at my house in Pennsylvania, not too far from our global headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey.
Wow, great part a superb part of the world. And early in the morning for you, mid-afternoon here for me. And let's dive straight in because we were looking at some of those that key statistic that I mentioned in the opening of today's episode of 62% of exhibitor respondents plan to attend shows with the same or increased frequency. Have things really bounced back post-pandemic to those sort of levels? If politicians are to be believed, which mostly they're not, they will take one set of statistics and, one politician will take a statistic and interpret it one way, another a completely different way. How accurate do we think those stats are?
So, data can be viewed in different ways, of course, but I can tell you from the experience that we've had beginning with CES in Las Vegas in early January through today, there is no question that the exhibit industry, events industry, the channel is very strong. It's come back full force, which has created its own set of problems, from staffing to being able to deliver on time. I think everyone was sitting on the sidelines for a little while waiting to see what would happen. And when CES went off, fairly well, I think everybody kind of came back in full force, and we're seeing that. We're seeing many of the congresses and expositions be, much stronger than they were in the past, both from an exhibiting standpoint and from an attendee standpoint.
There were undoubtedly contributing factors for those for that being the case, that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. On a fundamental level, is it as simple as saying that you don't know what you've got till it's gone, and in that period of time, people suddenly realize just how much they missed those opportunities, how much they lost by being able to go to those events in order to further their own businesses and understandings of their industries, whatever the particular event is servicing. Is that very much the driving factor behind this increased vigor in getting out there and into these exhibitions and conferences?
I think it's a great point, James. When you look at the results from the virtual work that many of us did over the course of the pandemic, I think we all felt pretty sad with the results. There is just a human tribal behavior that we as humans want to be around each other, want to network, want to bounce ideas. And I think you don't get that on screen. You don't get that the same way. You're not getting the experience the same way. And so as we look for networking opportunities, understanding what's happening to you, all the things that our channel provides, the reality is that face-to-face marketing, starting with the very first World's Fair till today, humans have become accustomed to doing that. And I do think you're right. I think that we didn't know what we had until it's gone. Many of us took it for granted and realized the thirst for face-to-face marketing was much more a reality than we had even recognized in the before times.
One of the key words in the intro that I read out today to describe Impact XM as a business is experiential marketing agency. my own take is that it's very, very difficult to deliver something that you could consider to be experiential via a digital medium, unless I suppose what you are delivering is in itself a digital medium, if that makes sense. We look at things like the gaming industry, computer games. It's very much an online digital world, but even so, they still have in-person events that they see great value in. And that's something that we've talked about on the podcast before. As an agency that works very much under the banner of experiential, would you agree with the fact that it really was difficult to sort of maintain that particular description of an event via a digital medium?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I love that you brought up gaming. We're seeing big arenas being filled with people watching gamers do their thing, right? They want to be there in person with them. And I think that translates to all industries. And as we really look at an experience, if you look at REI, for example, they've come out and said that their experiences will drive more revenue next year than their goods that they've sold. And they were really a goods company, outdoor company, but experiences have taken that over. I think as we start to look at what people's behaviors have been post-pandemic, not just in our channel, right, but just how they're behaving, everything is more experience driven. And I think we were already seeing that happen before the pandemic, but post-pandemic, it's exploded. So if we're not having those experiences, if brands aren't having those experiences, I think they're missing out. And if you look no further than what REI is saying, and a lot of other companies have shifted their model, we are really an experience economy now globally, and it's important that we pay attention to that, and brands pay attention to that.
Yeah, and it, as an experience economy, we're an experience society. I think even more so post
Sure.
pandemic. And it almost feels cliched to reference it, but people missed human interaction. This is
Mhm.
I'm not saying anything that nobody has said on 100 other podcasts and on 100 other TV shows and thousands of tweets and social media posts since the pandemic, but I think that as a society we are more tuned in to experiences and being with people, even if it's for a short period of time. And I just think to last night, my wife and I went out for dinner with friends, and we go to a little place that does a pop-up restaurant once a month. And we've started to go regularly. It's become our little thing on a Thursday evening once a month. It's something that we never did before. We saw a lot of them, but it's almost that structure of, we value that time. It's a couple of hours. And I think the same translates up to businesses, to events, that they suddenly realize that actually, even if it's for a short period of time, even if it's something that might only be one-to-one, it doesn't have to be in a big group of people. There is real value in that face-to-face in that face-to-face environment, I think. And again, I think that our social interactions are a big driving factor, I believe, in why we're seeing this increase in face-to-face events for businesses as well.
A great point. On the most simplistic level, I drive into New Jersey, into the office regularly, hybrid now, which I think we're all enjoying.
Mm,
But I cross through a national park here in the States, in New Jersey, as soon as I cross over the border from Pennsylvania. And it's a very large hiking area. In the past, you would see cars fill the parking lot and people there enjoying nature, enjoying the hikes. Since the pandemic, you can't get a spot in the parking lot. I think people are coming together for that experience of walking around, enjoying
mm.
nature, localized kind of experience with friends and family, just as you've mentioned your Thursday night
Yeah.
excursion. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. And you're exactly right. That bubbles up to all areas of our life, and certainly to our channel, which was already bringing people together in the before times, and I think even more so now. And I think businesses have recognized that there is a true value in this. And we've always had a difficult time looking at, I think, ROI in the channel itself. However, when it was gone, I think we also recognized that as difficult as the ROI may be at times, we recognized that there was nothing, and virtual was certainly no significant replacement for that face-to-face.
Mm. Something else I mentioned in the introduction today was this Global Recovery Insights report, and the line at the very end of that introduction that said that more brands are readying themselves to make the move to go global. And I guess I'm always curious to know what that means, because any brand with a Facebook page is global, in some respects. But
Mhm.
are you seeing with your own clients a genuine desire for brands that you're working with in the USA, for example, to then genuinely want to expand out and have a physical presence either at events or with their own, direct marketing experiential activities in other territories?
We have absolutely seen an explosion in global exhibiting, whether it's US companies going abroad or companies across the pond coming to the US. There have been a significant increase. Part of that, I think, is with the ability to travel having been shut down in a global economy.
Mhm.
Again, I think there was recognition of the inability to connect with our counterparts in other countries. And so brands recognizing this have adopted a strategy to take a look at holistic global approach to how the brand is received in different countries. And frankly, that's no small task, because how you address an audience in Europe is certainly different than in Asia, is certainly different in the States. So as companies kind of take a look at expanding their footprint in the side of the channel, which again, we're seeing a significant increase in, we're also seeing the need to kind of understand a little better how to do that. There are some large, Fortune 5 companies that are doing this really well and have been doing this really well for a while.
Mhm.
But a lot of the challenger brands that are now focused on how to exhibit internationally, I think are starting to learn the nuances of how to do things differently. And the requirement, frankly, of how to do those things differently is really important to speak to those different audiences.
Yeah, and something that sprung to mind there, and there is a link here. It might sound like a digression at first, but something that I've scribbled down here is that travel heightens the anticipation, and I think something that we missed out. As good as some of the virtual event platforms and digital platforms are, that we were afforded the luxury, I suppose, of using and learning about very very quickly during the pandemic. The one thing that you don't get with those is that sense of anticipation that you get when you're traveling somewhere. Be it could be a train journey into a city, it could be a car journey to the other end of a state or a country, it could be a plane journey over to an international event. But that traveling to an event and traveling to a face-to-face meeting or traveling to a face something, I think heightens the senses and increases a level of anticipation, which brings a level of productivity to that environment when you get there, that I think is very, very difficult to replicate on a digital platform.
I think that's a great point. Both exhibitors who, prepare for this event and then are traveling overseas, wherever that may be, or attendees. And let's face it, the reason why a lot of congresses and conferences are in, large, great, fun cities is because of the anticipation you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So we're not looking at a lot of cornfields to have these. We're looking at major metropolitan areas, desirable destinations, right? So I think there is not only an excitement about, the Congress itself, but also in parallel, an excitement about traveling again. And I think there was always an excitement
Yeah,
about
yeah.
traveling and going, but the fact that we're doing it again, I think, is complementary to that excitement.
Mm. I guess as well that with that return, that there will be inevitably a level of productivity that has improved because brands, people who go to these events, and maybe is not as complacent, if I dare say it, as they were
Mm.
pre-pandemic. I'm curious to know whether or not, with companies, you will obviously be pushing your clients and pushing the events that you're organizing and the brands that you're working with to do their absolute best. But I sensed a level of complacency within certain events and industries because it was almost just taken for granted that these would happen every year, that they would take place. And I think that that level of complacency has not been eradicated, but I'm seeing events that I'm working on, for example, trade shows, I'm seeing exhibitors be more proactive than they were before. I'm seeing attendees actually take advantage of some of the networking platforms and opportunities that are given to them. The engagement levels on those platforms have gone up, and networking apps and event apps and things like that. Yeah, I'm curious to get your take on what you think about whether was there any complacency pre-pandemic that really sort of came home to roost a little bit when the events were cancelled.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of complacency, and I think we just did things because we have always done them, and it just made sense to continue to do it that way. I think the pandemic really fast forwarded our channel by 10 years, right? We were always going to we were very analog. We were going to get more digital in our channel. And maybe that was going to happen in the next decade or so. But the pandemic really accelerated that. It also gave us pause to say what works and what doesn't work. So how do we allocate spend the right way into these different arenas? And when we really boil it down to um, almost a scorecard of what events are working for brands and what aren't. Putting those weighted KPIs and getting kind of a net promoter score on where we should be exhibiting, what events we should be exhibiting because of that return, I think is looked at a little differently today than it was before, because we were complacent, because we always went to things. Now there's a little bit more sophistication in how we're choosing events and how brands are looking at events. So as we advise our clients on where and how to go, a lot of it is predicated on, kind of better data, better understanding, and the challenge of do we really need to go back to these same events, or should we kind of reallocate the spend to really focus on these 5 or 6 global events that make the most sense to us, where we're really hitting some of those KPIs that we established for the reason that we have the spend in the channel in the first place.
Are you finding the clients are more open to creative suggestion? Because when I've spoken to other agencies, certainly in the past sort of 12 to 18 months, things lifted really sort of July last year in the UK. So
Mm-hmm.
things weren't back to normal in the autumn, but certainly we were seeing a return, to events as we knew them previously. And some agencies that I've spoken to have said that clients are very much more open to some of the creative suggestions that maybe pre-pandemic they were a bit hesitant to embrace. That they're a bit more of a suggestion. What are your own sort of experiences as an agency?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And even to take it a step back from that, I think they're much more open to thinking about the strategy of everything before we even get into creative. So
Mm,
taking a look at, what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and then creating that kind of thin red line to be able to bring creative into that in many different ways. So our creative solutions should be different when we're in Europe than they should be when we're in Pan Asia, than when we're in North America. All,
mhm,
all of those audiences relate differently, and so creative is a big part of that. How do we speak creatively to that audience differently than we would in another region of the globe? So I think it's not only about the creative acceleration and the willingness by brands to be able to look at things a little bit differently, but it's also what's the full strategy, what's the global strategy in exposition, and how we're going to activate that to make sure that we're speaking to those individual audiences. So I think obviously creative is a big part of it, but it has to be tied into the strategy, and strategy feels a lot different than it did just 2 years ago.
mm. How has it impacted your own? How's the return impacted your own operations? From a staffing point of view. What one thing you mentioned at the start of the podcast today was that that the industry faced as a whole an issue with staffing because
Mhm.
there were redundancies during the events industry, and certainly in the UK, one of the biggest criticisms levied towards government was that the lead time that the industry was given, the communication was poor as to when they would open. They were literally given like 2 weeks, right? As of that day, you can start doing your events again. And there was just no way that they were going to be prepared and ready to
Yeah.
just go from 0 back to 100 miles an hour in the space of a few weeks. And I'm just curious, how did that, if you excuse the pun, impact your own business? Were you in a similar situation, and have you found that you've had to actually bring more people on post pandemic because of some of the stats that you're seeing?
The beginning of the pandemic, as anybody else in our channel, we had staff reductions, and some people took early retirement. Some people moved on to a whole nother industry, recognizing this as a vital industry. So coming back, we recognized pretty early on in 2021 that
Mm,
early 2022 was going to be, a lot different than we had experienced in the previous 18 months.
yeah.
So in doing so, we started to hire back rather quickly. That said, you know as well as I do, hiring somebody today isn't a solution for tomorrow. It's a solution for next quarter or even
Yeah.
beyond.
Yeah.
So we had all of these new hires that didn't have the same intellectual property and kind of rear view mirror understanding of brands that we did in the before times. So
Yeah.
getting people up to speed quickly was a real challenge for us. And on top of that, with remote employees and hybrid employees, not being surrounded by other people who have that intellectual property and that brand understanding was a challenge. So how do we communicate with them differently? How do we onboard them differently? All became something that we hadn't experienced before, and we had to learn really, really fast. So I think there was this challenging ramp up period, for at least in the States, in Q1 of 2022, where it felt a lot like we were handing new hires a brick and giving a push into the deep end and having them support.
Yeah.
Since
Yeah.
that point, I think we've come out, much better. The nice part is about being able to hire anywhere in the globe, which was a different, kind of look at hiring through hybrid, through remote. We've been able to hire really strong people, and we've looked at other industries that have similar characteristics and requirements that may not have been in the event channel, because the folks that remained in the event channel pool were gobbled up pretty quickly in Q1 of 2022. So thinking outside the box and looking at, other verticals that really had that same sort of, deadline driven behaviors that we do in our channel helped us to kind of identify people who had never thought about working in the event space before. And we found some success there. So we are not fully staffed up yet in all areas, but we are certainly feeling a lot better than we did early on. And I think, brands understood that. It's the same way we would get on a plane very early on. We would get to an airport an hour early. The pilot says, "We're here. This is great." And then we sit for 2 hours waiting for a crew to be able to get us to our gate. And while frustrating, I think we all understood they were coming back online too. And I think our brands really, were supportive in the thinking that, we needed to kind of hire people, train them, onboard them, and get them moving. And so, the first part of the year was challenging from a staffing standpoint, but, I think for the most part, we're seeing the industry come back at a nice level now with staffing, but that's only happened recently.
I'm conscious of time, because I said at the very beginning today we've been very fortunate enough to get a small window of opportunity to speak to James today before he has to go to another meeting. Frequency is something I just want to touch on very, very briefly, if I may, James. It's not just an increase in footfall that we're seeing in through the doors of a particular event, but frequency and how often brands are undertaking events and having a presence somewhere, either under their own banner or underneath another exhibition or events banner. Is that something that correlates to what you're working on with your clients? Are they coming to you more frequently with more opportunities, saying we want to do more each year?
Yeah, it's really funny you say that. I was just having a conversation with one of my clients about this. We were talking about the fact that historically, when there's economic, storm clouds on the horizon, like we're experiencing right now, brands tend to pull back marketing dollars rather quickly, right? Those are some of the
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
dollars to drop off. We're not seeing that. We're seeing actually a thirst to continue to exhibit, to continue to participate in the channel and face-to-face marketing. And we're seeing an increase of what else can we do? Where else can we activate? So maybe it's not the four halls of a convention center, but maybe it's outside. Maybe it's in different ways that we haven't thought of before. Maybe we're bringing the exposition to them instead of the other way around. So not only, I think, are we seeing increase in number of events that brands want to participate in, which is, again, opposite of what we've seen historically with economic storm clouds on the horizon, but we're also seeing a challenge in how else can we activate our brand, experientially outside of the Congress channel itself. So not only frequency, but I think also diversification of how we're spending and looking at experiential marketing.
Fabulous. We've been talking today on the podcast to the Vice President of Client Service at Impact XM, Mr. James C. Morris, who joins us from his base in Pennsylvania today to squeeze in this episode of the Event Industry News podcast. James, again, one eye on the clock. I'm really grateful that we've had the chance to speak to you today. And as tight as it was, please do stay in touch and come back on, because I feel that this is sort of scratching the surface and maybe part one of a of a 2-part or even a 3-part conversation that we could have about this subject. So it'd be great to see you again, and do come back on the podcast in future, and let's pick up this conversation again if we may.
Thanks, James. I really appreciate you having me. Love what you guys are doing, and would love to come back sometime soon. So thanks again.
No problem at all. And a very quick wrap up from me. If you're watching today on the eventindustrynews.com website, thanks very much. Don't forget that you can go over to wherever you get your audio podcasts from. Just search for the Event Industry News podcast, and you can listen to audio only versions of all of our podcasts. If you are already doing that and listening today, go in the opposite direction to eventindustrynews.com, where you can watch video versions of all of our podcasts, as well as check out the latest news, features, supplements, and the A to Z supplier directory. It brings us nicely and neatly to the end of today's episode of the Event Industry News podcast. Our thanks again to Mr. James C. Morris from Impact XM. And if you want to find out more about those guys, just please do head over to impact-xm.com, and you can find out directly what they're up to. And thanks very much, everybody. James, look forward to seeing you again on another episode. Good luck with the rest of your day over in Pennsylvania and the rest of your meetings. And we wrap up today's episode by saying goodbye to everybody. Goodbye.